I'm Javier Gomez-Lavin. I'm currently an assistant professor at Purdue University, and I'm new here to the center. So that's a great question. I concentrate in philosophy of mind, empirically informed, philosophy of cognitive science, and experimental philosophy. I also have interest in aesthetics and a few other things. But by and large, my research and the work that I'm going to be doing here is in the domain of cognitive ontology and cognitive architecture. So how do we model minds? How do we build perhaps artificial minds? And what lessons can we take from previous work done in psychology and neurosciences? And also, what's the interaction? So, you might think that psychology and neuroscience doesn't really have a need for philosophy. They seem to be doing quite well, just a few buildings down, making discoveries every day. But they still use these concepts that are philosophically loaded that we've been using, I'd like to argue, since we ever started this whole process of cognitive architecture. So even Aristotle had a familiarity with the concepts of sensation and memory, and I would argue even attention. And so these are old, philosophically laden concepts, and they are honestly still doing a lot of the work in framing out how we study, how we understand the mind. And I'm kind of worried that maybe some of these concepts need to be updated, and that's philosophical work. And that's where I see my research project, especially here at the center, fitting into that story. So I've had a bit of a bugbear for a while in the form of working memory, which is this construct in psychology and cognitive neuroscience that is supposed to explain how we are able to flexibly solve problems and think through new solutions and imagine future possibilities. It's this kind of like a whiteboard that we have in the head, where we can take concepts and thoughts from across our mind and kind of mix them together and synthesize them to help create solutions to new problems. You might have heard it as this idea that you can only retain 7 or 5 things in your mind at one time. That's the classic Miller 7 plus or minus 2. And this has become a kind of de facto construct in our landscape of psychological concepts. And I've done work in the past where I've argued that it's not really doing much explanatory work. It doesn't explain how the mind gets to flexibly solve problems or how we get to do all the cool cognitive things that humans are said to do. And this is in part because what I think working memory does is it serves as almost a vessel for a lot of pre-commitments and intuitions that we have about how mind should work. That mind should flexibly solve problems, that mind should have a kind of flexible little whiteboard in the head, if you will. And I argue you can find that in almost any theory of the mind, going all the way back to Aristotle and his construct of phanesia, and I've argued that in print. So this is kind of a negative project. So the next step is, okay, if that's true, how do you build a mind without a working memory? What does that process even look like? What is the positive contribution here? And to be honest, it's a bit of a bait and switch. Like, I'm not saying we can't reason or we can't hold things in mind or we can't be conscious or we can't flexibly solve problems. I mean, we do this stuff every day. I just think that what we're seeing there is not indicative that there's a single system that manages that there's a magic holy grail, if you will, that does all that work, but rather that there are many systems that are composed of the ways we maintain and manipulate information, which are 2 functions that are critical for working memory. But rather than maintenance and manipulation being bounded in the single entity, we see them as kind of common constituents of cognition. Sometimes I call them the common currency of cognition. Everything requires maintenance and manipulation. And so part of what I'm trying to argue is that what we can do is we can still save what we want working memory to do, that we want to explain how the mind is flexible and how we can solve problems and do all the cool human cognitive stuff we think we can do. But I want to argue that rather than lump it all together into one capacity, we should respect that plurality, that diversity, the many ways that brains and people and groups can maintain and manipulate information. And I think if we start categorizing that, we're going to have a much richer conceptual vocabulary to be able to explain the cognitive successes that we humans enjoy. So this is what I've often called like a mosaic ontology, or like a constellation of cognition. And I'm going to argue that we can use new machine learning approaches and natural language processing in order to kind of help do some of the heavy lifting of looking at the literature in neuroscience and psychology and detecting what are these different ways that scientists are arguing that the brain maintains and manipulates information. So that's one project. And then the kind of larger term, long-term project is a book, which makes an even more kind of radical claim that circles back to what I started with, that we might need to have new concepts too. Like we might have to realize that some of these cognitive achievements that we care so much about in cognitive science, like reasoning, deliberation, and so forth, might be better understood as happening with others. So the paradigmatic case of reasoning might be best understood as something we do with others, like around a table or by simulating others through language. And that what we do in our heads when we kind of turn inwards and introspect and do the kind of Cartesian meditator move where we're like thinking through scenarios is obviously a kind of case of reasoning and deliberation, but I want to argue maybe it's a derivative case. It's a derivative version of what we do better with others. And so it's kind of like flipping the script and arguing that some of our cognitive achievements are only going to be best understood and modeled with others and not necessarily in the head of an individual. But that's like a longer term project that I hope to kind of address in this book that I'm starting.